Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a cozy, or perhaps uncozy, journey back in time, all the way to the heart of a medieval castle during the depths of winter. Imagine, if you will, the biting wind rattling through the arrow slits, the damp chill seeping into your very bones, and the ever-present scent of wood smoke mingled with, well, other things you probably don't want to think about right now. You're standing there, bundled in scratchy wool, perhaps sipping on something vaguely warm, and realizing that your modern thermostat fantasies are precisely that, fantasies. You probably wouldn't survive a single medieval winter without at least a mild case of frostbite or perpetual shivers. It really was a different world. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these sleepy history lessons travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together as we explore the boring history for sleep, how medieval castles stayed warm in winter, or, more accurately, how they tried to standing in the great hall, the stone floor a relentless absorber of any fleeting warmth. The air, thick and still, holds a constant, bone-deep chill that no amount of scurrying about seems to banish. You can see your breath, a faint cloud dancing briefly before dissipating into the cavernous space. This isn't just a slight nip in the air. This is a pervasive, unyielding cold that settles into your joints and makes every movement a little stiffer. The very walls around you, impressive and imposing as they are your greatest enemy in this battle against the elements. They are, after all, made of stone thick, unyielding, and utterly devoid of insulation. Picture a giant rock igloo, if you will, designed for defense rather than comfort. These castle walls, often many feet thick, were a marvel of medieval engineering for protection. They could withstand sieges, deflect arrows, and intimidate any would-be attacker. But for keeping the heat in, not so much. Stone is an excellent conductor of cold, meaning any warmth generated within the castle quickly leached out into the frigid air outside. It's like trying to heat a sieve with a candle. The cold from the ground would creep up the foundations. The cold from the air would press against the outer surface, and this relentless chill would radiate inwards, making the interior walls feel like ice. You could lean against one if you dared, and feel the energy draining right out of you. It's a bit like living inside a giant, very drafty refrigerator, except with less convenient access to snacks. Historians still argue whether the medieval builders fully grasped the thermal properties of their materials, or if the imperative for defense simply outweighed any consideration for comfort. It's likely a bit of both, but mostly the defense part. You wouldn't wrap your fortress in fluffy insulation, would you? That would make it less of a fortress. And speaking of less of a fortress, imagine the constant struggle to keep things dry. Stone is porous, and rain and dampness would seep into the walls, only to release that moisture slowly into the interior, further exacerbating the chill and creating a perpetual dampness that felt even colder than dry cold. It's the difference between a brisk winter day and stepping into a walk-in freezer. One is invigorating, the other just chilling to the core. So, as you drift off, perhaps you can appreciate the solid, unyielding nature of those walls, and perhaps, just perhaps, be grateful for the modern marvels of drywall and insulation. So, You're wrapped in that persistent cold, feeling the damp seep from the very stones. But the walls weren't the only culprits in this thermal conspiracy. You see, a medieval castle, despite its formidable appearance, was a surprisingly porous structure when it came to keeping the elements out. We're talking about more than just a little draft under the door. We're talking about a symphony of icy breezes whistling through every conceivable gap. Picture yourself shivering slightly as you realize the wind isn't just outside the castle, it's having a grand old time inside with you. First, let's talk about windows, or rather, the lack thereof in the modern sense. Early medieval castles often had narrow, unglazed arrow slits, mere vertical openings designed for archers to shoot out of, not for letting in sunlight or, crucially, keeping out the biting wind. Imagine living in a room with a constant, thin, cold blast of air streaming through several points. Even when glass started to become more common in the later Middle Ages, it was far from the double-paned, argon-filled marvels we have today. These were small, often ill-fitting panes, held together with lead, prone to rattling and leaking cold air. You might find oiled linen or animal bladders stretched across openings in less affluent areas of the castle, which offered some protection from the wind but made the interior even darker. It was a trade-off, light and a gale, or dimness and slightly less gale. A real Sophie's choice for the medieval resident, wouldn't you say? Then there are the doors. Massive, heavy oak, perhaps banded with iron, they looked impenetrable, and they were to invaders. To the cold, however, they often presented numerous avenues for ingress, gaps around the frame, the space beneath the door itself. These were minor gateways for the relentless chill. There were no rubber seals or fancy weather stripping. Think of a persistent whisper of cold air, a constant reminder that the outside world was never truly shut out. And don't forget the portcullis, that great iron gate that could be raised and lowered when it was up, or even when it was down but not perfectly flushed. It created an enormous opening for wind and rain to sweep right into the gatehouse, and often further into the outer baileys. And let's not overlook the delightfully named murder holes. These openings in the ceiling of a gatehouse allowed defenders to drop unpleasant things on attackers below. Practical for defense, yes, but for keeping the heat in, not so much. They were essentially unsealed vents to the outside, funneling cold air directly into strategic points of the castle. It's a bit like having a hole in your ceiling, only it's designed to help you defeat an invading army, not just let out all the heat your tiny fireplace is desperately trying to generate. Even the very construction of the castle, with its numerous interlocking towers, curtain walls, and internal courtyards, created intricate wind tunnels and shadowed, perpetually cold pockets. You could almost feel the cold swirling and eddying through the passageways, seeking out any crack or crevice to exploit. Historians still argue whether the layout of some castles was deliberately designed to create defensive crossdrafts, or if the ventilation was an unintended consequence of their defensive architecture. What is clear, however, is that living within these incredibly drafty structures meant a constant, often losing battle against the omnipresent chill. You might bundle up, huddle by a fire, but the cold was always there, a subtle, insistent presence, reminding you of the harsh realities of medieval life. It certainly makes you appreciate your tightly sealed, energy-efficient windows, doesn't it? So, you're shivering in your medieval castle, the drafts finding every vulnerable spot, and you're thinking, surely there's a roaring fire somewhere. And indeed there was. The The fireplace was, without a doubt, the primary source of heat in a medieval castle, the pulsing heart around which life often revolved, especially during those long, dark winter nights. But don't picture the neat, efficient wood-burning stoves of today, or the gas fireplaces that click on with a remote control. Oh no, the medieval fireplace was a beast of a different, often smoky, nature. You'd find colossal fireplaces in the great halls, often large enough to roast an entire ox, or at least a very substantial pig. Smaller ones would be in more private chambers, but even these were quite grand by modern standards. The sheer volume of wood consumed by these hungry hearths was staggering. Imagine armies of servants constantly ferrying logs, stacking them, and stoking the flames. It was a full-time job, and without it, the illusion of warmth would quickly vanish. You'd gather as close as you dared, feeling the intense heat on one side of your body, while the other side remained stubbornly, bracingly cold, still subjected to the castle's ubiquitous drafts. It was a bit like trying to toast half a marshmallow, one side perfectly browned, the other still stubbornly pale. But the real challenge with these magnificent fires wasn't just feeding them, it was dealing with their exhaust, smoke, medieval chimneys. While a significant improvement over open hearths in the center of a room were often far from perfect. They were wide, sometimes poorly designed, and prone to backdrafts. This meant that the roaring fire, while generating heat, also frequently filled the room with acrid, eye-watering smoke. You'd find yourself blinking through a haze, your clothes smelling perpetually of wood smoke, and your eyes stinging. It was a constant battle between warmth and air quality. One minute, you're basking in the glow. The next, you're doing an impromptu cough syrup commercial. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of respiratory ailments in medieval populations was more attributable to damp living conditions or constant smoke inhalation. Likely, it was a delightful combination of both. You can imagine the persistent coughs echoing through the cold, smoky halls. And while a roaring fire brought a semblance of cheer, it also brought danger. Sparks could fly, tinder could catch, and the constant threat of fire in a wooden-beamed castle was very real. Servants would have to be ever vigilant, often sleeping near the hearth to ensure no stray ember turned into a catastrophe. So, while the sight of a blazing fire offered psychological comfort and a precious source of heat, it came with its own set of medieval challenges. You'd be warm, yes, but perhaps a little singed, and certainly smelling like a campfire that's been put out with a bucket of damp rags. With the persistent drafts and the smoky embrace of the fireplace, you might imagine the medieval castle was one vast, echoing chamber. And for the most part, you'd be right. The Great Hall was undeniably the heart of any substantial castle, a place for feasting, for receiving guests, for holding court, and for attempting, often vainly, to generate some semblance of warmth. You step into this immense space, and immediately, its sheer volume hits you, not just visually, but thermally. It's like trying to heat an airplane hangar with a single log fire. These halls were designed to impress, to accommodate large numbers of people, and to project power. They often soared to the full height of the castle's interior, with vast vaulted ceilings or exposed timber beams reaching high above. The windows, even if they had some form of glazing, were often few and far between, and usually positioned high up, adding to the cavernous feel. This immense cubic footage meant that any heat radiating from the central fireplace no matter how vigorously stoked, would quickly rise, dissipate, and be swallowed by the cold air trapped higher up. It's the opposite of a cozy, low-ceilinged den. You could be sitting near the roaring fire, your face flushed while your feet remained stubbornly numb. It's a bit like trying to warm yourself with a birthday candle in a sports arena. Imagine trying to have a conversation, or even just exist comfortably in a space where the air currents were constantly shifting, carrying away any warmth, and where the stone walls relentlessly radiated cold. Even with the presence of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people gathered for a feast or a formal occasion, the sheer scale of the room often overwhelmed any collective body heat. You might find yourself huddling closer to your neighbors, not just for camaraderie, but for shared warmth. This inherent chill of the great hall often dictated the very rhythm of medieval life. Formal gatherings might be shorter in winter, meals eaten more quickly, and everyone, from the lord to the lowliest servant, would instinctively seek out the warmest available corner. A quirky tidbit: to combat the cold in these vast spaces, medieval people often brought their hunting dogs or even livestock into the hall during the coldest nights. While this provided a certain rustic warmth, it also added to the overall aroma profile of the castle. So, you might be warm, but you'd also be sharing your personal space with a rather pungent pig or a panting hound, which certainly adds a layer of immersive experience you probably don't encounter in your heated living room. Historians still debate the extent to which animals were routinely housed indoors versus being brought in only during extreme cold. But the anecdotal evidence suggests it was a common, if somewhat odorous, practice. So, next time you complain about your heating bill, spare a thought for the medieval lord, trying to project an image of power and comfort in a hall that was essentially a magnificent, but rather chilly, stone box. It certainly makes you appreciate the humble thermostat, doesn't it? As you shiver in the vast, echoing great hall, feeling the cold seep into every pore, your mind might naturally drift to the idea of a cozier nook, a smaller space where the heat from a fire might actually stand a chance. And indeed, this is where the concept of private chambers comes into play. A luxury, a privilege, and often the only true refuge from the pervasive chill of a medieval castle winter. These were the lords' and ladies' apartments, or those of high-ranking guests tucked away from the main thoroughfare of the castle. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of a VIP lounge, or at least a room that wasn't quite as exposed to the elements as the main public spaces. They were generally much smaller than the Great Hall, which, as you might guess, made them considerably easier to heat. With less volume of air to warm, the heat from a dedicated fireplace in such a room could genuinely make a noticeable difference. You might actually feel your fingers thaw, your toes tingle with returning circulation, and the perpetual shiver ease its grip. It was a tangible step up in comfort, like moving from a cavern to a well-appointed, albeit still drafty, tent. These private chambers often featured a bit more in the way of creature comforts. Perhaps a tapestried wall here, a rug there, simple wooden furniture. They might have boasted a proper, albeit still inefficient, fireplace that was perhaps cleaned more regularly, or at least had a slightly better draw for its smoke. The windows, if present, might be a little smaller, and therefore slightly less prone to massive drafts. It was still far from centrally heated, double-glazed bliss, but it was a distinct improvement. Here, you could perhaps sit and read a manuscript or mend some clothing without feeling like you were perpetually on the verge of turning into a human icicle. A quirky tidbit is that these private chambers also sometimes doubled as very informal meeting spaces or even dining rooms for intimate gatherings. The warmth of the fire, combined with the relative seclusion, made them ideal for discussions that didn't require the grand formality of the Great Hall. It was a place where you could let your guard down, literally and figuratively, from the biting cold and the constant scrutiny of the public areas. Historians still argue whether the increasing desire for privacy and personal comfort in the later medieval period led to the more sophisticated design of these chambers, or if the development of better heating methods simply allowed for more habitable private spaces. It's a chicken and egg question, but one thing is clear. If you were a medieval noble, your private chamber was where you truly sought solace from the winter's wrath. It's a reminder that even in the most austere of times, humans seek out their little pockets of warmth and comfort, no matter how humble they might seem to our modern sensibilities. So, you've found your way into the relative warmth of a private chamber, a small victory against the biting medieval cold. But even here, where the fireplace might actually make a dent in the chill, you'd notice something else on the walls, something beyond mere decoration: textiles and tapestries. These weren't just pretty pictures. They were crucial, though often overlooked, weapons in the constant war against the castle's frigid interior. Imagine the rough, cold stone walls, perpetually radiating chill. Now imagine hanging thick, woven fabrics over them. This wasn't just for aesthetic appeal, though the vibrant colors and intricate scenes on tapestries certainly brightened up a drab, often dim, room. Their primary function was surprisingly practical: insulation. These heavy tapestries, often wool or a wool-linen blend, acted as a barrier, trapping a thin layer of air between the fabric and the stone. This dead airspace was a rudimentary form of insulation, helping to slow the transfer of cold from the walls into the living space. It was a bit like wrapping your house in a giant, very elaborate blanket. You might not achieve modern levels of thermal efficiency, but every little bit helped. Beyond tapestries, you'd also find other textiles employed with the same purpose. Wall hangings of simpler design, sometimes just lengths of patterned cloth, would be draped. Even the use of curtains over windows and doorways, rudimentary as they were, served to block those insistent drafts that snaked their way through every crack and crevice. You'd pull them shut at night, hoping to seal yourself into a slightly warmer pocket of air, even if the effect was often more psychological than truly transformative. It's the medieval equivalent of putting a towel under a drafty door, but on a much grander, more artistic scale. And then there were the carpets and rush matting on the floors. While stone floors were easy to clean, they were incredibly cold underfoot. A thick layer of rushes, often strewn with fragrant herbs, or a woven carpet, provided another insulating layer between your precious, exposed feet and the relentlessly cold stone. This wasn't plush, deep-pile carpeting, mind you. It was more about adding a barrier to the cold than sinking your toes into luxury. A quirky tidbit is that these rush mats needed to be changed frequently, as they could become quite unsanitary, harboring fleas and other delightful creatures. So, while they offered warmth, they also offered an ecosystem. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of tapestries was primarily driven by their decorative value or by their functional utility in cold, damp castles. It's likely a happy marriage of both, providing beauty alongside a much-needed, if modest, degree of comfort. So, as you picture yourself nestled in a medieval private chamber, know that those beautiful wall hangings weren't just for showing off. They were a testament to the ingenious, if somewhat smelly, ways medieval people battled the ever-present chill. They truly were masters of making do with what they had, even if what they had often meant sharing their floor insulation with various tiny, scurrying residents. You've layered yourself in wool, you've admired the insulating tapestries, and you're still feeling that persistent medieval chill. Where then do you seek true warmth, true respite from the cold that seems to seep into your very bones? The answer, for the medieval noble at least, lay within the confines of their bedchamber, specifically the formidable four-poster bed. This wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a carefully constructed personal fort against the pervasive cold. Forget your modern, open-plan bedroom. The medieval bedchamber was often a small, enclosed space within the private apartments, designed to be as snug as possible. And at its heart stood the bed itself, a structure far more complex and purposeful than you might imagine. The four-poster bed, as its name suggests, featured 4 sturdy posts supporting a frame from which heavy curtains or drapes would be hung. These weren't decorative frills. They were essential for trapping the precious warmth generated by your own body. Imagine drawing those thick wool or velvet curtains all around you, creating a literal cocoon of relative warmth within the chilly room. This enclosed space acted like a miniature room within a room, holding in the heat. It's the medieval equivalent of a very personal, very elaborate sleeping bag. The air within the curtains would warm up from your body heat, creating a microclimate that was significantly more comfortable than the air outside the drapes. You might still feel a chill when you finally dared to poke your nose out from under the covers in the morning. But for the hours you spent nestled within, it was a profound relief. A quirky tidbit is that these beds were often incredibly tall, requiring a stool or even small steps to climb into. This wasn't just for grandeur. It helped to lift the sleeper further from the cold, damp floor. Another ingenious, if somewhat inconvenient, way to mitigate the chill. Historians still argue whether the elaborate carvings and often immense size of these beds were primarily status symbols or practical necessities for warmth and comfort. It's likely both. They were impressive displays of wealth, but their design also served a very real, very human need to escape the cold. Beyond the curtains, the sheer volume of bedding was also key. You wouldn't find a single duvet here. Instead, you'd be buried under layers upon layers of blankets, furs, and perhaps even a feather mattress. We'll delve more into those delightful materials in the next section, but for now, just picture the effort involved in making up such a bed each night. The drawing of the curtains, the layering of the covers, all designed to create that elusive bubble of warmth. It truly highlights the ingenuity born of necessity in a time before central heating. So, as you snuggle into your own perfectly climate-controlled bed tonight, spare a thought for your medieval counterpart, for whom a good night's sleep was a carefully orchestrated battle against the elements. So, you're tucked away in your impressive four-poster bed, the thick curtains drawn tight around you, creating that precious pocket of warmth. But what exactly was in that bed, or on it, that truly kept the medieval chill at bay? We're talking about feathers, furs, and fleeces, the natural and often incredibly effective insulation materials of the Middle Ages. Forget lightweight cotton sheets and synthetic duvets. Your medieval counterpart was buried under layers of natural fibers. each chosen for its ability to trap air and therefore heat. The base layer was often a straw mattress, which, while not the height of comfort by modern standards, did offer some insulation from the bed frame and the cold air beneath. On top of that, if you were lucky, you might have had a feather mattress. Now, this was true luxury. Down and feathers are incredibly efficient at trapping warmth, creating a plush, insulating layer that would mold to your body, holding in every precious degree of heat. It's the medieval equivalent of a high-quality camping mat, but far more opulent. Then came the blankets. Not just one or two, but multiple layers. Think thick, heavy wool blankets, often scratchy, but undeniably warm. Wool, even when damp, retains much of its insulating properties, a crucial advantage in a drafty, humid castle environment. On top of the wool, for those who could afford it, came the ultimate symbol of warmth and status: furs. Imagine being swaddled in bear, wolf, or fox furs, their dense pile trapping air and providing an almost impenetrable barrier against the cold. These weren't just decorative, they were survival gear, a tangible defense against hypothermia on the coldest nights. A quirky tidbit is that different furs were prized for different qualities, some for their softness, others for their extreme warmth, and some, like ermine, for their symbolic purity. And it wasn't just your bed. Your day-to-day clothing also relied heavily on these materials. You'd be wearing multiple layers of wool, perhaps linen underthings, and if you were out and about, a heavy wool cloak, often lined with fleece or fur. It was all about layering, just like modern campers or mountaineers do, but with natural, less refined materials. There were no lightweight, breathable synthetics, just the raw power of nature's insulation. Historians still argue whether the widespread hunting of animals for their furs contributed significantly to localized extinctions, or if the demand for warmth was simply met by available populations. What is certain, however, is that these materials were vital. They were the unsung heroes of medieval comfort, allowing people to survive and even thrive in structures that would otherwise have been almost uninhabitable in winter. So, as you pull your own warm, fluffy duvet up to your chin tonight, take a moment to appreciate the humble sheep and the various fur-bearing creatures that played such a crucial role in keeping your medieval ancestors from turning into human popsicles. They truly were the original architects of cozy sleep. As you lie nestled amongst your feathers and furs, a thought might occur to you. You're not entirely alone in this medieval chamber. Beyond the human inhabitants, another, often overlooked source of warmth in a medieval castle came from its animal companions. And no, I'm not just talking about the Lord's favorite hunting hound curled up by the fire. Sometimes, the line between pet and heat source blurred in delightfully practical, if somewhat aromatic, ways. Imagine, if you will, the constant, gentle warmth radiating from a sizable dog curled at the foot of your bed, or even under the covers with you, depending on your social standing and personal hygiene standards. Dogs weren't just for guarding or hunting. They were often integral parts of the household, especially in winter. Their body heat, particularly from larger breeds, could make a noticeable difference in a small, enclosed space. It's the original living hot water bottle, only with more fur and the occasional snore. And unlike a hot water bottle, a dog might even lick your face when you wake up, for better or worse. But it wasn't just canines. In the less private, more communal spaces, like the Great Hall, or even in the lower, less refined parts of the castle, You might find larger animals brought indoors during exceptionally harsh weather. We touched on this briefly before, but it bears repeating. We're talking about the occasional sheep, a goat, or even small cattle sheltering in the same building as humans. Now, before you recoil in horror, remember the medieval priorities. Warmth and survival often trumped pristine sanitation. The combined body heat of several large animals, even if it came with an accompanying symphony of bleats and moos, would undoubtedly raise the ambient temperature of a space. It's the ultimate communal heating system, fueled entirely by digestive processes. A quirky tidbit is that some cultures, particularly those in extremely cold regions, historically lived in close proximity to their livestock, with animal pens often directly beneath or adjacent to human living quarters, sometimes with a shared floor to allow heat to rise. While castles weren't generally designed this way, the principle of utilizing animal body heat for warmth was certainly understood, if somewhat haphazardly applied. Historians still argue whether this practice was a deliberate, sophisticated heating strategy or simply a pragmatic solution born of desperation during severe cold snaps. It was probably a mix of both, depending on the severity of the winter and the desperation of the castle inhabitants. So, as you picture yourself drifting off, perhaps to the gentle breathing of a slumbering hound, or the distant, muffled bleating of a sheep sharing the same vast hall, remember that medieval warmth often came with furry, four-legged, and sometimes surprisingly smelly companions. It certainly adds a certain rustic charm to the idea of a cozy night in, doesn't it? And perhaps it makes you appreciate your own quiet, pet-free bedroom even more. Beyond the individual warmth of furry friends and layered bedding, there's a more fundamental, if less glamorous, source of heat that often went unacknowledged but was undeniably crucial in a cold medieval castle: body heat and crowding. You might be thinking, well, isn't that just common sense? And it is. But in a world without central heating, every single degree mattered, and the collective warmth of many bodies packed into a space could make a surprising difference. Imagine a busy medieval feast in the Great Hall, or a gathering of retainers in a smaller solar. While the sheer size of the hall was an obstacle to warmth, the presence of dozens, even hundreds, of people within it generated a significant amount of heat. Each human body is essentially a small, self-regulating furnace, constantly emitting warmth. Multiply that by many individuals, and you get a cumulative effect. It's the reason why a crowded elevator always feels warmer than an empty one, or why a bustling marketplace doesn't feel quite as cold as a deserted street on a winter's day. People would naturally gravitate towards one another, not just for social interaction, but for the tangible benefit of shared warmth, huddling together by the fire, sitting shoulder to shoulder on benches, or even sleeping in close proximity. This wasn't just about camaraderie, it was about survival. A quirky tidbit: in some medieval monastic communities, monks would even sleep in communal dormitories, not just for spiritual reasons, but also for the practical benefit of shared body heat. Privacy, as we understand it today, was often a secondary consideration to warmth and safety. This principle extends beyond formal gatherings. Think about the servants and lower status individuals who often slept in dormitories or shared living quarters, sometimes even in close proximity to kitchens or stables where residual heat might linger. They might not have had the luxury of a private chamber or a four-poster bed, but what they did have was the collective warmth of their fellow castle dwellers. It was a less romantic notion of warmth, perhaps, but a highly effective one. Historians still argue whether the social structures of medieval life, which often involved large numbers of people living in close quarters, were a direct adaptation to cold living conditions, or if the warmth generated was merely a beneficial byproduct of the social and economic realities of the time. Regardless of the intent, the effect was undeniable. So, as you picture the bustling, crowded scenes within a medieval castle, remember that every person, every animal, contributed their own little bit of warmth to the overall thermal comfort, or lack thereof. It's a reminder that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective, even if they involve a bit less personal space than we're accustomed to. And perhaps, just perhaps, it makes you appreciate the quiet solitude of your own well-heated room just a little bit more. Having considered the bustling warmth of a crowded hall, your mind might wander to truly ambitious attempts at heating. You're familiar with modern underfloor heating, a truly luxurious marvel that bathes a room in gentle, even warmth. So, did medieval castles ever attempt such a feat? The answer is a fascinating, if rare, underfloor heating. Medieval attempts, while not common and certainly not widespread throughout every chamber of every castle, there were indeed instances where clever medieval engineers, or their Roman predecessors, tried to implement advanced heating systems. The most notable example is the Roman hypocaust system, which you might have encountered in the ruins of ancient Roman villas or bathhouses. This ingenious method involved creating a space beneath the floor, supported by small pillars. Hot air and smoke from a furnace outside would then be channeled through this underfloor void, warming the tiles above. The smoke would then exit through flues in the walls. It was, effectively, radiant floor heating, millennia before its modern resurgence. Now, while the Romans were masters of this, the technique largely died out in Western Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, becoming a lost art for several centuries. However, a quirky tidbit is that traces of similar, albeit often less sophisticated, systems have been found in some later medieval structures, particularly in monastic complexes or very high-status residences that might have been built on or near Roman ruins, or by individuals who had access to ancient texts or knowledge. These were not typically full-scale hypocausts, but rather attempts to channel hot air or smoke from a furnace through rudimentary ducts beneath a floor or within walls to provide a localized warmth. It was often more about preventing dampness and condensation than achieving widespread comfort, but the principle was the same. Imagine a small, very elite room in a grand castle, perhaps the Lord's private study, where a faint, even warmth emanated from the floor, a true rarity in a world of drafts and open fires. Historians still argue whether these isolated medieval instances were true, independent innovations, a rediscovery of Roman techniques, or merely accidental byproducts of specific architectural choices. It's an intriguing debate, highlighting the persistent human desire for comfort, even in the harshest conditions. These systems would have been incredibly labor-intensive to build and maintain, requiring constant fuel and vigilant cleaning to prevent blockages or fire hazards. They were certainly not the standard by any stretch of the imagination, making them all the more remarkable when discovered. So, as you relax, perhaps on a comfortably warm floor, spare a thought for those few, truly forward-thinking medieval individuals who dreamed of and sometimes even achieved the luxury of warmth radiating from beneath their feet. It was a fleeting but impressive glimpse into a warmer future. While the idea of medieval underfloor heating is a rare and intriguing anomaly, there was one place in almost every castle that consistently offered a degree of warmth, a hub of activity where fires burned almost continuously: the castle kitchen. This wasn't just a place for preparing meals. It was, by necessity, one of the warmest spots in the entire fortress. A true refuge from the pervasive chill of the great hall and the private chambers. You can almost smell it, can't you? The rich aroma of roasting meat, simmering stews, and baking bread, all mingling with the ever-present scent of wood smoke. The castle kitchen was a bustling, often chaotic environment, but it was also a powerhouse of heat. Imagine multiple large fireplaces, sometimes several, each large enough to spit roast an entire animal. Ovens, often built into the stone walls, would also be stoked with burning wood to bake bread and pies. All these heat sources, burning for hours on end, day after day, generated an immense amount of warmth that radiated throughout the kitchen space. This constant, high-temperature activity meant that the kitchen was often the warmest room in the entire castle, particularly in the lower levels where it was frequently situated. Servants and kitchen staff, who spent their days toiling amidst the heat and steam, would have a distinct advantage over their shivering counterparts in other parts of the castle. You might find yourself lingering by the entrance to the kitchen, just to catch a waft of that blessed warmth, even if it meant enduring the occasional shouted order or the intense smells of medieval cookery. It was a sensory overload, certainly, but a warm one. A quirky tidbit is that the kitchen's warmth wasn't just a byproduct of cooking. It was sometimes intentionally harnessed. In some castles, living quarters for lower staff might be situated adjacent to the kitchen, allowing them to benefit from the residual heat. The heat from the ovens and fires would permeate the surrounding walls, offering a degree of passive warmth to nearby rooms. It's the medieval equivalent of placing your bedroom above the garage for a little extra heat in the winter, only with more roasted boar. Historians still argue whether the strategic placement of kitchens within castles was primarily for practical reasons of food distribution and waste management, or if their inherent warmth was a significant planned advantage in colder climates. It's likely a bit of both, but the comfort they offered was undoubtedly a welcome bonus. So, as you picture the clatter and sizzle of a medieval kitchen, remember that amidst the hard work and the tantalizing smells, it was also a beacon of warmth, a truly invaluable asset in the constant struggle against the cold. It might not have been a place of quiet contemplation, but it certainly was a place where you could thaw out your chilled fingers and toes, even if only for a little while. Stepping out of the warmth of the castle kitchen, you're instantly reminded of the biting chill that pervades the rest of the medieval world. But even outside the direct glow of the hearth, medieval people had a crucial, often overlooked, ally in their fight against the cold: food and drink. This wasn't just about sustenance. It was about internal heat, a way to stoke the body's own furnace and provide a comforting, pervasive warmth from the inside out. Imagine the sheer calorie intake required just to maintain body temperature in such cold conditions, let alone perform the often strenuous physical labor of medieval life. People ate hearty, often fatty, foods precisely because these provided the necessary fuel for warmth. Think rich stews, thick with meat and root vegetables, generous portions of bread, and perhaps even cheese. These slow-burning fuels kept the metabolic fires roaring, helping to generate internal body heat. It's the medieval equivalent of carbo loading for warmth, rather than for a marathon. You wouldn't find many light salads on the winter menu unless you were actively trying to embrace hypothermia. And then there were the drinks. Forget iced water or chilled sodas. In a medieval castle, especially during winter, your beverages were almost universally warm, or at least room temperature, which was often still quite cool. Mulled drinks were particularly popular. Imagine a steaming mug of spiced ale or wine infused with cloves, cinnamon, and ginger. Not only did these spices add flavor, but they were also believed to have warming properties. The alcohol, of course, would also contribute a temporary feeling of warmth, though we now know this is largely due to vasodilation, bringing blood closer to the skin, which actually causes heat loss in the long run. But in the moment, that comforting flush would feel like a blessing. A quirky tidbit: even water, often of dubious quality, might be boiled to make it safer to drink, and thus, incidentally, served warm. Historians still argue whether the medieval diet, with its emphasis on heavy, calorie-dense foods, was purely a matter of what was available and affordable, or if there was a conscious understanding of its role in maintaining body temperature. It was likely a combination. Necessity dictated what could be grown and harvested, and centuries of trial and error probably taught people what foods provided the most sustaining warmth. So, as you picture yourself huddled by a meager fire, know that the steaming bowl of pottage or the tankard of warm ale wasn't just filling your stomach. It was literally helping to keep you alive, stoking the inner embers against the relentless chill. It certainly makes that hot chocolate or warm tea on a cold day feel like a direct lineage from these medieval survival strategies, doesn't it? Even with thick walls, roaring fires, and warming food, the medieval castle's chill was a constant adversary. So, how else did people manage to generate and maintain warmth? The answer is as simple as it is effective: winter activities, keeping active. In a world without passive heating systems, staying warm often meant staying in motion. Imagine yourself as a medieval inhabitant. You wouldn't be sprawling on a couch watching historical documentaries. Instead, your days would be filled with tasks that, almost by their very nature, generated body heat. Whether you were a lord, a lady, or a servant, physical activity was interwoven with daily life. Consider the physical labor of maintaining a castle, chopping wood for those enormous fireplaces, hauling water from the well, tending to livestock, or simply moving supplies from one part of the sprawling fortress to another. These weren't quick, easy tasks. They were often strenuous, requiring significant muscular effort. You might be breaking a sweat even on a frosty morning, simply by going about your chores. It's the medieval version of an intense gym session, only with more practical outcomes and fewer protein shakes. Even for the nobility, life wasn't entirely sedentary. While they might not be chopping wood themselves, they would oversee estates, engage in hunting, or practice their martial skills in the castle courtyard. Think about the exertion involved in training with swords or engaging in mock combat. Certainly enough to get the blood pumping and ward off the chill. Even indoor activities like dancing during a feast or the preparation for one involved movement and exertion. A quirky tidbit is the concept of pace eggs or hot cross buns during Easter, which, while not strictly for warmth, were part of a seasonal cycle of more active festivities after the long, cold, and often less active winter months. The medieval calendar was punctuated by feasts and celebrations that often involved dancing and physical games. serving not just as entertainment, but as a way to collectively generate warmth and boost spirits during the colder seasons. Historians still argue whether the robustness of medieval individuals was primarily due to constant physical activity, or if natural selection simply favored those who could endure harsh physical conditions. What is clear, however, is that a sedentary lifestyle was rarely an option. If you wanted to stay warm in a medieval castle, you had to earn it through movement. So, as you picture yourself enduring a medieval winter, remember that stillness was a luxury rarely afforded. Every step, every lift, every swing of an axe wasn't just a task completed. It was a tiny victory against the pervasive, bone-chilling cold, a testament to the fact that sometimes the best way to heat your home is to simply be your own heater. So, you're moving, you're eating, you're wrapped in layers. But what about when you just need a concentrated burst of warmth, something portable and immediate? This is where the ingenious, if sometimes perilous, device of the brazier comes into play. Imagine a small, often ornate, metal container designed to hold burning coals or charcoal. It was the medieval equivalent of a personal space heater, albeit one that came with significant risks. These portable warmth sources were crucial in spaces where a full-sized fireplace wasn't feasible or available, or for individuals who needed extra heat. You might find a brazier brought to your private chamber if the fire was dying down, or placed near a scribe working late in a chilly scriptorium. Picture the deep, glowing red of the coals, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls and radiating a surprisingly intense heat in a localized area. You could gather around it, holding out your hands, feeling the immediate relief as the warmth permeated your chilled fingers. It was a tangible, comforting presence in a world often dominated by cold. However, a quirky tidbit is that while braziers provided warmth, they also posed a significant danger. Burning charcoal or coals produce carbon monoxide, an odorless, colorless gas that is highly toxic. In poorly ventilated medieval rooms, using a brazier could quickly lead to suffocation or carbon monoxide poisoning. It was a silent killer, and many a medieval individual likely succumbed to its invisible embrace, attributing their malaise or death to a sudden illness. So, while you might cherish the momentary warmth, you'd also be playing a dangerous game with your own respiration. It's the medieval equivalent of trying to warm your room with your car engine running indoors, which, as we all know, is a spectacularly bad idea. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly understood the dangers of carbon monoxide poisoning, or if the frequent deaths associated with braziers were simply accepted as an unavoidable risk of trying to stay warm. It's likely that they recognized the danger of fumes and poor ventilation in a general sense, but lacked the scientific understanding of the specific gas. Consequently, while braziers were a vital tool for combating the cold, they were also a grim reminder of the inherent perils of medieval life. So, as you picture yourself hovering over a glowing brazier, feeling its warmth on your face, remember the hidden dangers swirling in the air around you. It certainly makes you appreciate your smoke detectors and carbon monoxide alarms, doesn't it? The simple act of staying warm was often a gamble, a quiet dance with the unseen forces of nature. You've considered the warmth of the fire, the layers of clothing, and even the perilous brazier. Now, let's consider a part of the castle that, while not warm itself, offered a surprising kind of thermal stability: the undercroft. This subterranean, or semi-subterranean level of a medieval castle, often beneath the Great Hall or other main structures, wasn't about warmth in the sense of heat, but about consistent, albeit cool, temperatures. Imagine descending a set of stone steps into a dimly lit, vaulted space. The air here feels different. It's cool, certainly, but it's also remarkably stable, unlike the upper levels, which are exposed to the wild fluctuations of external temperatures. Baking sun in summer, biting winds in winter. The undercroft benefits from the insulating properties of the earth itself. The ground acts as a massive thermal mass, slowly absorbing heat in the summer and releasing it in the winter, creating a relatively constant temperature year-round. This means that while it never felt truly warm, it also rarely reached the freezing extremes experienced above ground. The undercroft served various practical purposes. It was often used for storage, barrels of ale, sacks of grain, preserved foods. Its stable, cool environment was ideal for keeping provisions from spoiling too quickly, especially before widespread refrigeration. Think of it as a giant, very primitive walk-in cellar. You might also find workshops, or even some lower-status sleeping quarters down here, precisely because of this thermal consistency. For those who toiled in these spaces, the lack of extreme temperature swings, while still chilly, was a small blessing. A quirky tidbit: in some castles, the undercroft might have contained the castle's well or cistern, again benefiting from the consistent, cool temperatures to keep the water fresh. The very stone foundations that made the castle a cold, drafty place above ground, paradoxically, made the undercroft a haven of thermal stability below. Historians still argue whether medieval architects fully understood the principles of thermal mass and subterranean insulation, or if the consistent temperatures of the undercroft were simply a fortunate byproduct of building deep foundations for defensive purposes. It was likely a combination, with generations of practical experience informing their building choices. So, as you picture the cool, still air of the undercroft, with its vaulted ceilings and thick stone pillars, remember that warmth isn't just about heat. Sometimes it's about the absence of extreme cold. It's a reminder that even in the most basic forms of engineering, clever solutions emerge from necessity. And perhaps, just perhaps, it makes you appreciate the consistent, unchanging temperature of your refrigerator a little bit more. A modern marvel that owes a subtle debt to the medieval undercroft's steady cool, leaving the relatively stable, if cool, embrace of the undercroft. Let's venture into another necessity of medieval castle life that was anything but warm: the garderobe. Now, if that word doesn't immediately conjure an image, allow me to clarify. A garderobe was, quite simply, the medieval toilet, and while it served a vital, if unglamorous function, it was also, without fail, one of the coldest and draftiest spots in the entire castle. Imagine needing to answer nature's call in the dead of winter. You'd probably trudge down a cold, narrow passage, perhaps fumbling with a small lamp, until you reached a small, unheated chamber. This chamber would typically contain a stone seat with a hole situated directly above a chute that emptied either into the castle moat, a cesspit, or directly down the side of the castle wall. This design, while crude, was ingenious in its simplicity for waste disposal. However, for thermal comfort, it was an absolute disaster. The very design of the garderobe, with its open chute to the outside, created a constant, unwavering draft. Wind would whistle up the shaft, bringing with it not only a chilling breeze, but also as you can well imagine, the distinctive aromas of what had recently departed the castle. It was a ventilation system, certainly, but one that prioritized airflow over warmth, and certainly over pleasant smells. You can picture yourself sitting there, bundled in your woolens, enduring the icy blast on your nether regions, counting the seconds until you could escape back to the slightly warmer, less pungent parts of the castle. It's the medieval equivalent of having an outdoor toilet in Siberia, but perhaps a few floors up. A quirky tidbit is that the word garderobe literally translates from Old French as to guard the robes. This is because the constant draft of air through the chute was believed to help air and preserve clothes that were hung in the small chamber, protecting them from moths and dampness. So, in a strange twist of medieval logic, your toilet doubled as a rudimentary, albeit very smelly, airing cupboard. Historians still argue whether this clothes guarding function was a primary design intention or simply a happy, perhaps aromatic accident that people made the best of. Regardless, it certainly makes you appreciate your modern heated bathroom with its flush toilet and delightful lack of a perpetual updraft. The discomfort of the garderobe was a stark, chilly reminder of the daily realities of medieval living, where even the most private moments were subjected to the relentless cold. Having explored the bone-chilling realities of the garderobe, it becomes abundantly clear that living in a medieval castle, particularly in winter, was a constant battle against the elements. This relentless cold, combined with dampness and often questionable hygiene, had a profound impact on the inhabitants' well-being. So, let's turn our attention to winter's impact on health, specifically the common ailments and the grim realities of cold-related illnesses that plagued medieval people. You might think of a medieval winter as merely uncomfortable, but for many, it was a period of genuine peril. Exposure to constant cold and dampness significantly weakened the body's defenses. One of the most common afflictions would have been respiratory illnesses. Imagine the perpetual coughs, sniffles, and chest congestion exacerbated by the smoky air from inefficient fireplaces and the ever-present drafts, bronchitis, pneumonia, and what they might have simply called winter coughs would have been widespread, especially among the young, the old, and those already weakened by poor nutrition or other diseases. A simple cold could quickly escalate into something far more deadly. Then there were the ailments directly linked to the cold itself. Frostbite was a very real danger, particularly for those whose duties took them outside for extended periods, like guards on the battlements or laborers. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses were all vulnerable to the numbing, destructive power of extreme cold. Beyond acute frostbite, there was the insidious threat of chilblains, painful inflammation of small blood vessels in the skin caused by repeated exposure to cold but not freezing temperatures. You'd have itchy, swollen, red patches on your extremities, a persistent irritation that would make even simple tasks uncomfortable. A quirky tidbit is the medieval belief in humors, where illness was thought to be caused by an imbalance of the four bodily fluids. Cold and dampness were often associated with an excess of phlegm, leading to treatments that focused on drying out or warming up the patient, sometimes through bizarre concoctions or restrictive diets. While their understanding was limited, their observations of cold's effects were accurate. Historians still argue whether the medieval understanding of disease based on humors hindered effective treatment, or if it provided a framework, however imperfect, for managing symptoms in an era before germ theory. Beyond the purely physical, the relentless cold and the long, dark nights would also take a toll on mental well-being. The lack of sunlight could contribute to a form of seasonal affective disorder, leading to lethargy and low spirits. You can picture the quiet despair, the longing for spring, as the days crawled by, each one bringing another icy breath. So, as you snuggle deeper into your covers tonight, grateful for modern medicine and the warmth of your home, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors, for whom winter was not just a season, but a formidable adversary, constantly testing the limits of human endurance. It was a time when staying alive was often a struggle, and even a minor chill could carry a deadly consequence. Having considered the health perils brought by the medieval winter, let's step outside the relative, if meager warmth of the castle's interior, and focus on those who faced the elements head-on, the sentinel's peril. Imagine yourself as a guard, standing watch on the battlements or at a gatehouse, enduring the biting cold hour after hour. This was a duty that tested the limits of human endurance, making the discomforts inside seem almost luxurious. You're positioned on the castle walls, high above the ground, exposed to the full fury of the wind. There's no respite from the chilling gusts that whip around you, carrying with them rain, snow, or simply the raw, unadulterated cold of the open air. Why? Our breath plumes in front of you, a constant visual reminder of the frigid temperatures. Your vision might be obscured by sleet, your hands numb within thick gloves, and your feet growing steadily colder inside your boots, despite layers of wool. It's an isolating, deeply uncomfortable experience, where every minute feels like an hour. The sentinel's life was a testament to the fact that defense outweighed comfort. Those arrow slits we talked about earlier, so effective for shooting out of, were also perfect for channeling icy drafts directly onto the guard. There was no glass to protect them, no heated booth, just stone, wind, and the unyielding duty to keep watch. You'd shift your weight, stamp your feet, and perhaps swing your arms to try and keep the blood flowing. But the cold was a relentless, pervasive enemy. It was a constant battle against the creeping numbness, the slow onset of hypothermia, and the temptation to simply seek shelter. A quirky tidbit is that sentinels often had to recite a challenge and response, or blow a horn at regular intervals, not just to confirm their vigilance to their comrades, but also as a way to keep themselves awake and alert in the face of the mind-numbing cold and monotony. Imagine trying to form coherent words when your jaw is stiff with cold and your lips are numb. Historians still argue whether the high incidence of desertion or illness among castle garrisons in winter was more attributable to the physical hardship of sentinel duty, or to the overall poor living conditions within the castle. It was likely a devastating combination, pushing many to their limits. So, as you picture the solitary figure on the battlements, a silhouette against the stark winter sky, remember the extraordinary fortitude required to perform such a vital yet utterly brutal duty. Their vigilance, often endured in near-freezing conditions, was the first line of defense, a silent, shivering promise of safety for those huddled inside. It makes you grateful for modern security systems and the luxury of a warm, unexposed job, doesn't it? The sentinel's peril truly highlights the stark realities of medieval winter survival. After contemplating the grim vigil of the sentinel, you might naturally wonder if medieval castle builders ever learned from their chilly experiences. Did they simply accept the cold, or did they adapt and improve? Indeed, over the centuries, There was a subtle but significant castle design evolution that aimed, however modestly, for better insulation and greater comfort. It wasn't a sudden revolution, but a gradual shift in priorities. Initially, early castles, Matan-Bailey structures, or simple stone keeps were built almost exclusively for defense. Thick walls were paramount, and comfort was a distant second. But as warfare evolved, and as lords and ladies began to desire more permanent, sophisticated residences, the notion of livability began to creep into the architectural plans. You start to see changes that, while still prioritizing security, also tried to mitigate the harsh realities of medieval winter. One key development was the increasing sophistication of fireplaces and chimneys. While never perfectly efficient, later medieval fireplaces were sometimes designed with narrower flues or better positioned hearths to improve the draw of smoke and reduce backdrafts. This meant less smoke billowing into the room and potentially more heat radiating outwards. You might even find examples of double fireplaces where two hearths shared a central chimney stack, allowing for more warmth in adjacent rooms. Another subtle change was the increasing use of internal passages and staircases. Earlier castles often required you to go outside or into open courtyards to move between different parts of the castle. Later designs began to incorporate more enclosed circulation routes, protecting inhabitants from the elements while moving from, say, the Great Hall to their private chambers. This seems like a small detail, but imagine the difference it made to avoid stepping into an icy courtyard every time you needed to visit a different part of the building. It's the medieval equivalent of adding an enclosed walkway between two buildings. A quirky tidbit is the development of smaller, more numerous chambers within the castle, moving away from just one or two vast, impossible-to-heat halls. This fragmentation of space, while perhaps driven by a desire for more privacy, also had the beneficial side effect of creating more manageable areas for heating. A smaller room, as we've discussed, is simply easier to warm up. Historians still argue whether these architectural shifts were a direct response to the perceived discomforts of earlier designs, or if they were merely a reflection of evolving social norms and a burgeoning desire for more luxurious living spaces among the nobility. Whatever the primary driver, the outcome was certainly a step, however small, towards more thermally forgiving castles. So, as you reflect on the slow creep of progress, remember that even in the seemingly static world of medieval castles, the quest for comfort eventually left its subtle, warming mark on stone and mortar. As the medieval castle evolved, so too did the fundamental challenge of keeping its fires burning. For all the discussions of stone, textiles, and design, nothing mattered more than the constant supply of fuel. Let's delve into the vital topic of fuel sources, wood and peat, the primary means by which medieval people attempted to conjure warmth from the cold air. Imagine the sheer scale of consumption. Those enormous fireplaces in the Great Hall, or even the smaller ones in private chambers, devoured vast quantities of wood. This wasn't just a casual trip to the lumberyard. It was a constant, arduous, and often dangerous undertaking. Wood was king. Forests surrounding castles would be managed, and sometimes even cleared, to provide the endless supply of logs needed for heating, cooking, and various crafts. You can picture gangs of woodcutters, bundled in rough wool, toiling in the frozen woods, felling trees with axes, and dragging the heavy logs back to the castle. It was an essential, unending chore, the very pulse of winter survival. The type of wood mattered to hardwoods like oak and beech, burned hotter and longer, providing more sustained warmth, but were harder to cut and transport. Softer woods like birch or pine burned more quickly, but were easier to gather. There would have been a constant assessment of supply versus demand, a never-ending logistical puzzle to keep the hearths alight. And, of course, the wood needed to be seasoned, dried out for months, sometimes years, to burn efficiently and reduce smoke. Green wood, while available, would have created an unbearable amount of smoke and very little heat. In certain regions, particularly those with boggy landscapes, like parts of Ireland, Scotland, and Northern Europe, peat served as an alternative or supplementary fuel source. Imagine the back-breaking labor of digging peat from the bogs, the damp, heavy blocks then laid out to dry in the wind. It was a smelly, messy process, but for communities without access to extensive forests, it was a lifeline, a quirky tidbit. The distinctive aroma of burning peat is still cherished in some parts of the world today, particularly in Scotch whiskey production, where it's used to dry the malted barley, imparting a characteristic, smoky flavor. Historians still argue whether the availability of specific fuel sources shaped regional castle architecture and heating practices, or if methods of heating were developed independently of the local environment. With the vast amounts of wood and peat required to keep a medieval castle even remotely warm, it becomes clear that the entire system relied heavily on a dedicated workforce. Their day began long before dawn, and for many, it ended long after the last ember glowed. Think of the sheer physical exertion involved in fetching and hauling. Someone had to split those massive logs, carry them from the woodpile to the various fireplaces throughout the castle, and constantly feed the hungry flames. This wasn't a one-time delivery. It was a continuous, back-breaking process, especially for the Great Hall's colossal hearth. You'd see servants perpetually moving, their breath misting in the cold air, their arms laden with timber. Beyond fetching fuel, there was the ongoing task of maintaining the fires, stoking them, raking out ashes, and ensuring they didn't go out entirely, especially during the night. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to tend a fire. Your fingers numb, your body aching, just so the castle's occupants wouldn't wake up to a completely frozen environment. It was a 24/7 job, demanding constant vigilance and physical resilience. A quirky tidbit is that some servants, particularly those responsible for the fireplaces in private chambers, might even have slept near the hearths themselves. Historians still argue whether the hierarchical structure of medieval society, which placed such heavy demands on the lower classes, was simply accepted as the natural order, or if the constant grueling labor of keeping warm was a significant source of hardship and resentment among servants. What is undeniable, however, is that without their tireless efforts, the medieval castle would have been an even colder, more inhospitable place. So, as you picture the bustling activity within the castle, remember that every flicker of flame, every wisp of smoke rising from a chimney, represented the unseen and often unacknowledged labor of countless servants. Their endurance, often taken for granted, was a foundational pillar of medieval life, proving that warmth, like so many other comforts, was a privilege often built on the sweat and toil of others. It certainly makes you appreciate your automated heating system and the simple act of pressing a button, doesn't it? We've journeyed through the various methods and challenges of keeping warm in a medieval castle, but it's crucial to remember that this experience was far from universal. The approach to battling the cold, and indeed the very expectation of comfort, varied significantly depending on your station in life. Let's explore the stark contrast of noble versus commoner warmth within the confines of the same castle walls. Imagine yourself as the lord or lady. You'd reside in the most advantageous parts of the castle. The private chambers with their dedicated fireplaces, the 4-poster beds with layers of feather mattresses and fur blankets, and perhaps even the occasional rare underfloor heating system. You would have a retinue of servants constantly tending fires, bringing warm drinks, and ensuring your clothing was sufficient. Now, shift your perspective. Imagine yourself as a common soldier, a kitchen hand, or a stable boy. Your reality would be vastly different. Your clothing would be practical wool, perhaps, but certainly not lined with expensive furs. You'd be more exposed to the raw elements, both indoors and out, and the daily grind of your duties would mean constant exposure to the cold. You might share a drafty room with a dozen others, where the only real heat came from the distant kitchen or the warmth of the animals in the stable. A quirky tidbit is that the very architecture of the castle often reinforced this social hierarchy of warmth. The higher you ascended in social status, the higher up in the castle you often resided, enjoying more light and air, but also potentially more exposure to drafts. Conversely, the lower levels, while sometimes warmer due to the Earth's insulation, were also typically reserved for servants and storage, reflecting their lower status. Historians still argue whether the stark differences in living conditions within castles exacerbated social tensions, or if they were simply accepted as an inevitable part of the feudal system. What is clear, however, is that warmth was a commodity, distributed unevenly along the lines of power and privilege. So, as you picture the inhabitants of a medieval castle enduring the winter, remember that how warm they stayed was not a universal experience. It was a lived reality shaped by their place in a rigid social hierarchy, a silent testament to the unequal distribution of comfort and hardship. It certainly makes you appreciate the democratic nature of modern heating, where the flip of a switch can bring warmth to almost anyone with an electricity bill, doesn't it? We've spent much of our time imagining the bitter cold of a northern European medieval winter, a familiar image of drafty stone and bundled figures. But the medieval world was vast, and castles existed in a multitude of climates. So, let's consider southern castles. Different challenges, even in sunnier, seemingly warmer regions. The struggle for comfort was real, though the nature of the challenge shifted. Imagine a castle perched on a sun-drenched hill in Spain or Italy. You might think, blessed warmth. And indeed, the winters would rarely be as harsh as those in, say, Scotland or Germany. Snow might be rare, and temperatures might hover above freezing for much of the season. However, this doesn't mean these castles were bastions of year-round comfort. They faced their own unique thermal challenges, often centered on dampness and the lack of consistent heating solutions designed for truly cold snaps. Firstly, while the daytime temperatures might be mild, nights could still become surprisingly cool, especially in the pre-dawn hours. Stone, regardless of location, is an excellent thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly during the day, but also radiates cold slowly at night. So, a room that felt pleasantly warm at midday could become quite chilly by midnight, especially if it lacked a dedicated fireplace. you'd still find yourself needing layers and blankets, just perhaps not the thick furs required further north. Secondly, and perhaps more significantly, was the issue of dampness. Many southern regions experience significant rainfall and sometimes high humidity even in winter. Without proper drainage and damp proofing, this moisture would seep into the porous stone walls, leading to a pervasive, clammy chill that felt even more penetrating than dry cold. It's the difference between a brisk, dry winter day and stepping into a refrigerator with a leaky seal. This dampness also contributed to mold and mildew, making the air feel heavy and unhealthy. A quirky tidbit: in some regions, castle courtyards might feature intricate drainage systems, not just for hygiene, but also to try and manage rainwater and prevent the castle interior from becoming too saturated with moisture, which would only exacerbate the cold. Historians still argue whether the architectural choices in southern castles, such as larger windows or more open courtyards, reflected a greater emphasis on light and ventilation over thermal insulation, or if these designs were simply a natural adaptation to a generally warmer climate. It's likely that builders in these regions prioritized keeping cool in summer, which inadvertently made winter comfort more difficult. So, while you might escape the blizzards of the north, a medieval winter in a southern castle still meant contending with a persistent, penetrating dampness and a chill that, while not life-threatening, was certainly far from comfortable. It certainly makes you appreciate the climate control systems that efficiently manage both heating and humidity in your modern home, doesn't it? The medieval world, north or south, always found a way to make you appreciate warmth. We've journeyed through the drafts, the fires, the furs, and even the surprisingly stable cool of the undercroft, witnessing the myriad ways medieval people tried to stay warm. Now, as our journey nears its end, let's take a moment for a modern comfort contrast. It's a humorous, yet deeply appreciative, reflection on just how far we've come in the simple art of keeping warm. Imagine, if you will, the gentle click of a modern thermostat. You set it to a comfortable 22 degrees Celsius, and within minutes, the subtle hum of your furnace or heat pump begins, pushing warm air through vents or radiating warmth from underfloor pipes. The entire house, from floor to ceiling, achieves a uniform, predictable, and utterly delightful temperature. You can walk barefoot, wear a t-shirt in January, and never once worry about a draft whistling through your murder holes. Your biggest concern might be whether the smart home app is connected, or if you remembered to pay the utility bill. It's a far cry from strategically layering wool and hoping the servant remembers to stoke the fire. Think about the sheer simplicity of it all. No armies of woodcutters, no choking on smoke, no huddling with farm animals for warmth. Your insulation keeps the heat in, your double-paned windows sealed the cold out, and your heating system works tirelessly, silently, without complaint or carbon monoxide. You have instant access to hot water, a concept that would have seemed miraculous to most medieval castle dwellers, who often relied on boiling water over an open fire for a tepid bath. A quirky tidbit, emerging as technological advancements made such consistent, predictable comfort widely accessible. For most of human history, comfort was a fleeting state, not a default setting. Historians still argue whether this pervasive modern comfort has made us softer, less resilient, or simply freed up our time and energy for other pursuits. While it's fun to imagine living in a castle, facing down a dragon, or even just dealing with a medieval winter, the reality was often genuinely harsh. So, as you luxuriate in your perfectly climate-controlled environment, perhaps sipping a hot beverage that came from an instantly boiling kettle, take a moment to truly appreciate the marvels of modern engineering. The quiet hum of your heating system is a symphony compared to the creak of a drafty door or the sizzle of a brazier. We live in an age of unprecedented warmth and convenience, a stark and humorous contrast to the perpetual chill that defined much of medieval life. It certainly puts your first world problems into a rather cozy perspective, doesn't it? We've journeyed from the biting cold of uninsulated walls to the luxurious simplicity of a modern thermostat. Now, as our gentle historical journey winds to a close, let's reflect on the profound resilience of those who endured the medieval winter. Our final thought is on enduring cold. A final thought, appreciating the quiet strength and resourcefulness of castle inhabitants, and allowing ourselves to drift deeper into the comforting hum of history. You've imagined the constant chill, the pervasive dampness, the smoky air, and the sheer physical effort required just to stay moderately warm. It was a life undeniably shaped by the elements. A world where the concept of comfortable was redefined to mean not actively freezing to death. Yet, medieval people were not merely victims of their environment. They adapted, they innovated, and they found ingenious ways, however rudimentary by our standards, to cope. They used what was available: stone, wood, textiles, animal heat, and their own industrious labor to carve out pockets of warmth and survival. Think of the sheer determination, the servants relentlessly hauling logs, the laundresses battling frozen fabrics, the guards enduring their solitary, icy vigils, the families huddling together around a meager fire. This wasn't just about physical survival. It was about mental fortitude, about finding comfort in community, in a hot meal, or in the simple act of pulling a heavy wool blanket tighter. Their lives, while challenging, were rich with sensory details that we often overlook in our perfectly modulated environments. The distinctive scent of woods, the feel of rough wool, the sound of wind whistling through a distant arrow slit. These details, though sometimes harsh, formed the texture of their daily existence. Historians still argue whether the perceived toughness of medieval people was a biological adaptation over generations, or simply a necessity imposed by their challenging environment. What is certain, however, is that they developed a profound resilience, a capacity to endure discomfort that many of us in our climate-controlled cocoons can scarcely imagine. Their stories, often quiet and mundane, are a testament to the human spirit's ability to find ways to thrive, even when faced with relentless adversaries like the cold. So, as you picture the last embers glowing faintly in a medieval hearth, and the moon casting long pale shadows over the silent castle walls, let the quiet hum of history surround you. Imagine the soft rustle of a heavy curtain, the distant sigh of the wind, the gentle crackle of cooling stones. Feel the lingering warmth of our shared historical journey, and know that even in the most challenging of times, humanity finds ways to create its own small, precious havens of comfort. The world outside your window might be still, the sounds of your home soft and familiar. Feel the gentle weight of your blankets, the comforting warmth of your room. Let your mind drift from the thick stone walls and the smoky fires, from the huddle of bodies and the endless task of hauling wood. All that effort, all that struggle has faded into the quiet annals of time. You are safe, you are warm, and the echoes of those distant medieval winters are now just a whisper, a soft, soothing memory. Allow yourself to sink deeper into your bed, feeling the peaceful calm settle over you. Good night and sweet dreams.